They say money talks, but wealth whispers. And revenge. Revenge waits until the cameras are rolling. You are about to hear the story of Julian Sterling, a man who thought he was the king of New York. He walked into the season's most exclusive diamond gala with his mistress on his arm, convinced his quiet, dutiful wife was at home. He didn't realize that the red carpet he was walking on, the champagne he was drinking, and the very company he claimed to own were all paid for by her. This is the story of the night Julian learned the most expensive lesson of his life: never bring a pawn to a queen's game. Julian Sterling adjusted his cufflinks in the reflection of a tinted Escalade window. They were onyx rimmed in platinum, a gift from the board of directors after the third quarter merger. He looked every inch the titan of industry the Wall Street Journal had painted him to be just last week. At 42, Julian possessed that rare predatory charisma that made shareholders swoon and competitors sweat. He was the CEO of Sterling Vane, a logistics conglomerate that had seemingly risen from the ashes of mediocrity to dominate the eastern seaboard. Or rather, he had risen. The Vane in Sterling Vane belonged to his wife's family, a name that had been etched into the bedrock of Manhattan since the Gilded Age. But the Vanes were a dying breed, quiet, dusty, and allergic to the spotlight. Julian had dragged their legacy into the 21st century or so, he told himself every morning. "Are we clear on the timeline?" Julian asked, not looking at the driver. "Yes, sir. Drop off at the Pierre Hotel for the pickup, then the Metropolitan Museum of Art by 7:30 p.m. The driver replied. Julian checked his Patek Philippe. 6:15 p.m. Perfect. He pulled out his phone and swiped to a contact saved simply as S. Message wearing the red one. Reply. "The one you bought me." "Obviously. I want them to stare." Julian smirked. Tonight was the Obsidian Gala. It was the premier charity event of the year, a black-tie masquerade of wealth where tickets cost 50,000 a plate. The proceeds were allegedly going to art restoration, but everyone knew the real purpose. It was a peacocking ground for the ultra-rich, and tonight Julian intended to be the loudest peacock. He wasn't just attending, he was the keynote speaker. He was going to announce the new global expansion of Sterling Vane. And he decided in a stroke of arrogance that would later be studied by divorce attorneys for decades that he deserved to have his muse by his side. His wife, Vivian. She hated these things. Vivian Vane, she refused to take his last name, a point of contention early in their marriage that he had eventually ignored, was a ghost. She was 38, pale, with sharp features that were more handsome than beautiful. She spent her days in their sprawling Connecticut estate, tending to her prize-winning orchids and reading obscure historical biographies. She was old money, in the worst way Julian thought boring. When he had left the house that morning, she was in the solarium, wearing a frantic mess of a cardigan covered in potting soil. "You're staying in tonight?" he had asked, already knowing the answer. Vivian hadn't even looked up from her cymbidiums. "You know crowds give me migraines, Julian. Besides, the Obsidian Gala is ostentatious. It's not really us, is it? It's business, Viv. It's necessary." He had lectured her, hiding his relief. "I'll represent the family. You rest." She had snipped a dead leaf with a distinct, sharp click. "Yes, you represent us, Julian. Make sure they know exactly who you are." He hadn't caught the tone then. He was too busy thinking about Sienna. Now the Escalade pulled up to the Pierre. The doorman opened the door, and the cold November air rushed in, mixing with the scent of Julian's Creed Aventus cologne. Sienna was waiting in the lobby. If Vivian was a watercolor painting fading in the sun, Sienna was a neon sign in a thunderstorm. 26, a former runway model for Gucci, with skin the color of mocha and eyes that could strip a man of his common sense. She was wearing the dress, custom Versace crimson silk that clung to her like a second skin, with a slit that went up to her hip. Around her neck sat a diamond choker that Julian had charged to the corporate hospitality account. She slid into the car, bringing the smell of jasmine and ambition with her. "You're late," she teased, kissing him on the cheek. "Traffic on 5th, Julian lied. He looked her over. "You look expensive." "I look like the future Mrs. Sterling," she whispered, a dangerous game they had been playing for 6 months. "Are you sure about this, Julian? Bringing me? What if someone talks?" Julian laughed, a low, rumbling sound of pure hubris. "Let them talk, Sienna. I am the company. I just closed the Singapore deal. The board eats out of my hand. Besides, Vivian is in Connecticut, burying herself in dirt. She doesn't have the internet, let alone friends who attend these kinds of parties. Her circle is dead people and flowers." "And the donors?" Sienna asked, checking her makeup in the compact mirror. "The old guard. Dinosaurs." Julian waved a hand. "They need my energy. Tonight I step out as the face of the new era, and I want you there when I do." He genuinely believed it. He believed that his competence was the shield that protected him from consequences. He believed that the Vane family name was just a rusty wrapper he had kept for nostalgia. As the car approached the steps of the Met, the flashes of the paparazzi turned the night into a strobe-lit war zone. "Ready?" Julian asked. Sienna smiled, flashing perfect veneers. "Showtime." The red carpet at the Obsidian Gala was not merely a walkway. It was a courtroom where you were judged by the heavy hitters of New York society. Anna Wintour was near the entrance, her sunglasses on despite the darkness. To the left, Anderson Cooper was speaking with a frantic producer. When Julian stepped out, the cameras pivoted. He was a rising star, a man who looked great on a magazine cover. He extended a hand and helped Sienna out. The reaction was immediate. A ripple of confusion followed by the frantic clicking of shutters. Click, 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 click. Mr. Sterling over here. Who is the guest, Mr. Sterling? Where is Mrs. Vane tonight?" Julian ignored the questions about his wife, guiding Sienna to the step and repeat. He placed a possessive hand on her waist. They posed. He felt powerful. He was defying the stuffy conventions of his wife's world, injecting sex appeal and modernity into a stagnant lineage. As they moved up the stairs, entering the great hall, the atmosphere changed. Outside it was chaos. Inside it was judgment. The theme was gilded noir. The massive hall was decked in black velvet, towering arrangements of dark red roses, and thousands of floating LED candles. It was somber, majestic, and intimidating. Julian spotted Arthur Penn, the chairman of the board for Sterling Vane. Arthur was a man of 70, holding a scotch like it was a weapon. He was talking to a woman whose back was turned to Julian, a woman in a striking floor-length gown made of what looked like woven silver and black feathers. "Arthur," Julian boomed, steering Sienna toward them. Arthur turned. His eyes dropped to Sienna's slit, then up to Julian's face. The warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Julian, you made it." "Wouldn't miss it. Arthur, have you met Sienna?" "She's a consultant on our branding team." Julian lied smoothly, though the diamond choker screamed otherwise. Sienna extended a hand. Charmed Arthur. Arthur didn't take it. He just nodded a microscopic movement. "Julian, a word privately." Julian frowned. "Now I'm about to go find our table." "Now," Arthur said. The steel in his voice was new. Julian excused himself, leaving Sienna by a towering ice sculpture of a swan. He walked Arthur a few feet away. "What is it, Arthur?" "The stock is up 12%. "It's not the stock," Arthur hissed, his voice low. "It's the optics. Do you know who is here tonight?" "Everyone is here, Arthur. That's the point." "No, I mean the patrons, the Circle of 12. Julian rolled his eyes. The Circle of 12 was an urban legend, a supposed group of old money families who quietly controlled the charity circuit in New York. "Fairy tales, Arthur. Let me enjoy my night." "Julian," Arthur grabbed his arm. "Look at the program." "Have you looked at the program? I wrote the speech, Arthur. I don't need to read the program." Arthur looked at him with something resembling pity. "You didn't write the welcome address or the founder's dedication." Before Julian could reply, a chime resonated through the great hall. It was the sound of a crystal glass being struck, amplified over the speakers. The room hushed instantly. Julian turned back to find Sienna. She was chatting with a young heir to a shipping fortune, looking radiant. He felt a surge of pride. He had won. He had the power, the girl, and the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed from the stage. "Please take your seats. The Obsidian Gala is about to begin." Julian grabbed Sienna and moved toward the front. "Come on, we're at table 1, the CEO's table." They walked past the B-listers, past the politicians, right to the front center table. It was set for 10, but currently empty. "Best seats in the house?" Sienna whispered, impressed. Julian pulled out her chair. As he sat down, he glanced at the intricate place card holder made of obsidian. It read, "Mr. Julian Sterling." Next to it, however, the place card did not read "Guest." It read, "Mrs. Vivian Vane." Julian stiffened. "That's a mistake," he muttered, reaching out to flip the card over or hide it. "What is?" Sienna asked. "Nothing. Just a clerical error. My wife isn't coming." He shoved the card into his tuxedo pocket. "Excuse me." A waiter appeared, a man with white gloves and a terrifyingly blank expression. "Sir, I must ask you to return the placement card to the table." "I told you my wife isn't—" "The seating chart is absolute, sir, directed by the chairwoman." "I am the CEO of the sponsoring company," Julian snapped. "Yes, sir, but you are not the chairwoman of the foundation." Julian blinked. "The foundation Sterling Vane sponsors this." "Actually, sir," the waiter said, his voice dropping an octave, "the Vane Heritage Trust sponsors this event. Sterling Vane is merely a corporate partner." Julian felt a small prick of irritation. Vivian's family trust. Of course, she probably signed a check 6 months ago and forgot about it. He slapped the card back on the table. "Fine. Whatever." The lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. "And now," the announcer's voice echoed, "to welcome you to the 75th Annual Obsidian Gala, please welcome the President of the Vane Heritage Trust and the architect of tonight's gathering." Julian adjusted his tie, preparing to stand up. He assumed they meant him. He was the one who ran the business. He was the one who authorized the funds transfer. "Mrs. Vivian Vane." Julian froze. He was halfway out of his chair. Sienna looked at him. "Julian." "Sit down." The applause was polite, but thunderous, the kind of applause reserved for royalty. From the side of the stage, a figure emerged. It wasn't the frumpy, gardening-obsessed woman Julian had left in Connecticut that morning. The woman walking to the microphone was wearing the silver and black feathered gown Julian had seen earlier on the woman talking to Arthur. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was styled in a sleek architectural wave reminiscent of 1940s Hollywood. She wore sapphires, massive dark cashmere sapphires, that Julian had never seen before. It was Vivian. She walked with a predator's grace, not a gardener's shuffle. She stepped up to the mic, her eyes scanning the room. The spotlight caught the jewels at her throat, making them blaze. She looked out into the darkness, and for a terrifying second, her eyes seemed to lock directly onto Table 1, onto Julian, onto Sienna. She smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "Good evening," Vivian said, her voice smooth, low, and devoid of the stutter she sometimes had when he yelled at her. "Welcome to my house." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at the woman on stage, then back at Julian. "That's your wife," Sienna hissed. "The one who digs in the dirt." Julian couldn't speak. He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling slightly. "Tonight," Vivian continued, "is a night of revelation. We are stripping away the veneer to see what lies beneath. Some of you are here to be seen. Some are here to hide. And some," she paused, tilting her head, "are here to find out who really pays the bills." The applause died down, but the tension in Julian's chest was just ramping up. He sank back into his chair, the velvet upholstery suddenly feeling like a trap. "I didn't know she was coming," Julian whispered to Sienna, keeping his lips barely moving. "She told me she was sick." Sienna was no longer looking at him with adoration. She was looking at him with calculation. She was a survivor. She knew the smell of danger. "You said she was a recluse, Julian. You said she was pathetic." "She is," Julian insisted, though his voice cracked. "I don't know what this act is." Vivian finished her opening remarks, witty, charming, and terrifyingly authoritative, and stepped off the stage. The lights came up for the first course. Julian expected her to stay backstage. Instead, she walked straight down the center aisle, flanked by 2 men. One was Arthur Penn. The other was a man Julian recognized from the tabloids, Alessandro Valenti, the Italian shipping magnate and a known rival of Sterling Vane. She was heading straight for Table 1. "Fix your face," Julian hissed at Sienna. Vivienne arrived at the table. The air around her seemed to drop 10 degrees. She didn't look at Sienna. She looked only at Julian. "Julian," she said. Her voice was light conversational. "I see you brought a guest to fill my seat. How resourceful." "Vivian." Julian stood up, his napkin falling to the floor. "What are you doing here?" you said. "I said crowds give me migraines." She interrupted, a small icy smile playing on her lips. "But I never miss the Obsidian Gala. My grandmother founded it after all. Did you really think I'd let you give the keynote speech without supervision?" She turned her gaze to Sienna. It wasn't a glare. It was an inspection, like one might look at a termite found in the floorboards. "And you must be Sienna," Vivian said. Sienna, to her credit, stood up. She was taller than Vivian in her heels, but somehow seemed smaller. "Mrs. Sterling. I didn't realize." "Mrs. Vane," Vivian corrected softly. "I kept my name. It opens more doors." She glanced at Sienna's neck. "Lovely choker. From the corporate hospitality account, I believe, line item 402, client gifts." Sienna went pale. Julian choked on air. "How did you—" Julian stammered. "I'm the majority shareholder, Julian," Vivian said, as if explaining gravity to a toddler. "I read the audits. Every single one. She gestured to the empty seat next to Julian, the one with her name card. But please don't let me interrupt your date. I'll be sitting with Alessandro tonight. We have much to discuss regarding the Asian logistics routes. She placed a hand on Alessandro Valenti's arm. Valenti, a man who had tried to buy Julian's company in a hostile takeover 3 years ago, smirked at Julian. Your wife has a brilliant mind for strategy, Sterling. Valenti said, his Italian accent thick and mocking. She was just explaining to me how over-leveraged your Singapore expansion is. That's confidential information. Julian snapped loud enough for the next table to turn heads. Not when the owner of the company shares it, Vivian replied coolly. Enjoy the salad, Julian. I heard the bitter greens are excellent tonight. She turned and walked away, taking the oxygen in the room with her. Julian sat down hard. She knows, Sienna whispered. Julian, she knows about the necklace. She knows about us. She's bluffing, Julian said, wiping sweat from his forehead. She's trying to rattle me before the speech. She can't touch me. I have the board. Arthur is on my side. Arthur was walking with her, Sienna pointed out. Arthur is managing her. He's playing along to keep the peace. Julian poured himself a glass of wine, bypassing the waiter. Watch. When I get up there for the keynote, I'm going to remind everyone who actually makes the money in this family. She's just a figurehead, a checkbook. The first course arrived. Bitter greens with a blood orange vinaigrette. Julian couldn't eat. He watched Vivian at the next table, laughing with Valenti. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely unbothered. He checked his phone. An email from his lawyer. Subject urgent. Asset freeze. Julian frowned. He tried to open the attachment, but the signal in the hall was jammed. He looked at his phone bars. No service. Do you have signal? He asked Sienna. Full 5G, she said, scrolling Instagram. Why? My phone is dead. Maybe you didn't pay the bill. Sienna quipped, her voice tight. She was starting to realize that the King of New York might be a jester. It's a glitch, Julian muttered. The main course came and went. Filet mignon rare. Julian drank 3 glasses of Merlot. He needed the liquid courage for his speech. This was his moment. He would go up there, announce the expansion, dazzle the crowd, and prove that he was the engine of Sterling Vane. Vivian could play her mind games, but the market listened to him. The lights dimmed again. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer said, please welcome to the stage for the keynote address, Mr. Julian Sterling. Julian stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Sienna. Watch this. He walked to the stage, the applause polite, but noticeably more muted than it had been for Vivian. He stepped up to the podium, arranged his notes, and looked out at the sea of black ties and diamonds. Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. Julian began, his voice booming. Tonight we celebrate excellence, but excellence is not an inheritance. It is not something you are born into. He glanced pointedly at Vivian's table. It is something you build, something you earn. He was going off script, fueled by anger. When I took over Sterling Vane 10 years ago, it was a legacy company collecting dust. Today, it is a global powerhouse. And tonight I am proud to announce our acquisition of the Red Star Line in Singapore. He paused for applause. There was none. Instead, a murmur went through the crowd. People were looking at their phones, whispering, showing screens to each other. Julian frowned. I said the acquisition of the Red Star Line. Suddenly, the massive screen behind him, which was supposed to show the company logo, flickered. It didn't show the logo. It showed a bank statement, a massive blown-up PDF of a wire transfer from Vane Heritage Trust to Sterling Vane corporate accounts. Amount $500, $1,000, $1,000. Date, yesterday. Status cancelled. The crowd gasped. Julian turned around and saw the screen. His heart stopped. "What is this?" he shouted into the mic. "Cut the feed. Technical difficulties." But the image changed. It was a legal document. Notice of termination of employment. Name, Julian Sterling. Position, CEO cause, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, misuse of company funds. The room erupted. Julian stood frozen, the bright light blinding him. He looked for Arthur. Arthur was looking at the floor. He looked for Vivian. Vivian was standing up at her table. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked like a judge delivering a death sentence. She raised her champagne glass slightly in his direction. Then the microphone cut out. Julian tapped it. Thump, thump. Nothing. He was a man shouting in a silent room, while his ruin was broadcast on a 40-foot screen behind him. The silence that followed the microphone cut was heavier than the applause had ever been. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the massive great hall of the Metropolitan Museum was the hum of the projector fan and the distant clink of silverware from the back tables, where people were too slow to realize history was collapsing in front of them. Julian Sterling stood on the stage, a man marooned on an island of light. He tapped the dead microphone again. Thump, thump. A futile, pathetic gesture that only emphasized his impotence. Behind him, the screen still glowed with the undeniable 60-foot proof of his termination. Cause embezzlement, misuse of company funds, breach of fiduciary duty. He looked to the wings of the stage. The tech crew wasn't scrambling to fix a glitch. They were standing with their arms crossed, looking at him. One of the stage managers, a woman he had barked at during rehearsal, was openly checking her phone. "Arthur." Julian's voice cracked without amplification, shouting into the void. "Arthur, stop this. It's a hack. Get security." Arthur Penn didn't move from his seat at table 1. He slowly took a sip of his scotch, his eyes fixed on the stage, with the detachment of a man watching a building demolition he had authorized permits for. Then the murmurs began. It started as a low buzz, like a hive of disturbed wasps, and swelled into a roar. Every phone in the room was raised. The flashes were blinding now, a strobe light of shame. Julian shielded his eyes, trying to see the audience, but all he saw were lenses. From the darkness of the floor, a voice cut through. It wasn't amplified, but in the acoustic perfection of the hall, it carried like a gunshot. "It is not a hack, Julian." The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Vivian Vane walked toward the stage. She didn't rush. She moved with the terrifying inevitability of a glacier. She stopped at the base of the stairs, looking up at him. From his vantage point, she looked like a queen passing judgment on a peasant. "Vivian," Julian hissed, leaning down, desperation clawing at his throat. "What have you done? You're destroying the stock price. You're destroying the company." "My company," she corrected her voice, projecting clearly to the first 10 rows. "The stock will recover. The cancer, however, had to be cut out." "Cancer." Julian straightened up, his face flushing a deep, violent red. "I built this. I took your father's dusty warehouses and turned them into a logistics empire. You were planting flowers while I was in the trenches." Vivian signaled to someone in the tech booth. The image on the screen changed. It was no longer the termination notice. It was a spreadsheet, a detailed line-item expense report labeled Project Sienna. The crowd gasped. The list was exhaustive and humiliatingly specific. Van Cleef & Arpels diamond choker, $145,000, billed to warehouse security upgrades. Four Seasons presidential suite, $12,000 night billed to client acquisition. Porsche 911, lease, £3,500 month billed to fleet maintenance. You didn't build an empire, Julian, Vivian said, her voice raising just enough to be heard by the silent, rapt audience. You built a lifestyle, and you build it to the Vain Heritage Trust. She walked up the first 2 steps of the stage, closing the distance. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think because I prefer the quiet of the greenhouse to the noise of the boardroom that I was blind? I can explain, Julian stammered. The choker, it was for a client, a high-net-worth individual. Vivian laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. Julian, stop. The client is sitting at table 1, and she's wearing the evidence. Every head in the room swiveled to table 1. Sienna was frozen. She had been trying to shrink into her chair, hoping the floor would swallow her whole. Now, with 1,000 eyes on her, including the predatory gaze of Anna Wintour and the lenses of the paparazzi, she looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, covering the diamonds. That necklace, Vivian continued, pointing a gloved finger at Sienna, without looking away from Julian, was purchased on March 14th, the same day you laid off 200 workers at the Ohio Distribution Center to cut costs. You told the board we needed to tighten our belts. I suppose you meant their belts so you could buy prettier things for your mistress. The crowd turned hostile. These were wealthy people, yes, but even the ultra-rich had a code. You didn't steal from the company coffers to fund an affair while firing the help. It was tacky. It was sloppy. It was unforgivable. Security, Vivian said calmly. 2 large men in dark suits emerged from the wings. They weren't the venue security. They were private contractors. Julian recognized one of them he used to drive for Vivian's father. Mr. Sterling, the first guard said, his voice flat. Please come with us. You can't do this, Julian shouted, backing away. I am the CEO. I have rights. I have a contract. Your contract had a morality clause, Julian, Vivian said, ascending the final step to stand beside him. She was inches from his face now. He smelled of fear and stale wine. She smelled of rain and victory. Section 4, paragraph B. Gross misconduct and misappropriation of funds immediately voids all severance, stock options, and tenure. You leave with nothing, not a share, not a cent. She reached out and with a gentle, almost tender motion, plucked the microphone from the podium. She tapped it. It came alive instantly. She had controlled the sound the entire time. Get him out of my sight, she commanded. The guards grabbed Julian by the arms. He struggled his tuxedo jacket, bunching up his dignity, shredding with every step. Vivian, you need me. You don't know how to run the Asia deal. The unions will eat you alive, he screamed as they dragged him toward the stage exit. Vivian watched him go, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the stunned audience. She smoothed her dress. My apologies for the theatrical interruption, she said into the mic, her voice regaining that warm, gracious tone of a perfect hostess. But as we all know, true clarity only comes after the storm. Please enjoy the dessert. It's a dark chocolate tart with sea salt. I find the bitterness refreshing. She walked off the stage to thunderous applause. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was the applause of a colosseum that had just watched a gladiator fall. The air in the great hall was electric, buzzing with the adrenaline of the spectacle. Waiters were moving again, pouring wine with trembling hands, while guests leaned over tables frantically whispering and tweeting. Sienna sat alone at table 1. The chair next to her, where Julian had sat, was empty. The chair across from her, where Arthur Penn had been, was also empty. He had moved to join Vivian at the Valenti table. The other guests at the table, a tech billionaire and his wife, had turned their backs on her, completely erecting a wall of social exclusion, so dense it felt physical. Sienna's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to leave. She needed to get out before the cameras came back for her. She grabbed her clutch and stood up, her legs shaking in the high heels. She kept her head down, hair curtaining her face, and made a beeline for the exit. "Going somewhere," the voice came from behind a pillar near the cloakroom. It wasn't Julian. Sienna froze. She turned to see Vivian Vane standing there. Vivian wasn't alone. She was flanked by the same 2 guards who had disposed of Julian. I'm leaving," Sienna stammered. Her bravado, her model stare, her carefully curated arrogance, it was all gone. She was just a 26-year-old girl who had bet on the wrong horse. "Not yet," Vivian said. She stepped closer. Up close, Sienna could see the lines around Vivian's eyes, the only sign of the stress she had been under. But her eyes themselves were clear and hard as the sapphires around her neck. "I didn't know." Sienna lied, her voice trembling. "He told me you were separated. He told me the marriage was a business arrangement." "It was a business arrangement," Vivian agreed pleasantly. "I provided the capital, the name, and the legitimacy. He provided the labor. But when the labor becomes expensive and embarrassing, the business arrangement ends." Vivian looked Sienna up and down, her gaze lingering on the red dress. "Versace, custom, 12,000, charged to the corporate Amex on September 4th. Sienna pulled her coat tighter around herself. "I'll pay it back. I have money." "We both know you don't, Sienna," Vivian said softly. "I know about your credit card debt. I know about the lease on your apartment in Soho that Julian co-signed. I know that without him, you're 3 weeks away from eviction." Sienna's eyes widened. You investigated me." "I investigate every investment," Vivian said. "And you, my dear, were a very poor investment on Julian's part. High maintenance, low return." Sienna bristled, a flash of her old fire returning. "He loved me. He was going to leave you." Vivian laughed, a genuine, amused sound. "Oh, honey, Julian doesn't love people. He loves reflections. He loved you because you made him look young and successful. He loved me because I made him look rich and established. We were mirrors, nothing more." Vivian took a step closer, invading Sienna's personal space. She held out a hand, palm up. The leather of her glove creaked. "The necklace," Vivian said. Sienna clutched her throat. "He gave it to me. It was a gift." "It was purchased with stolen funds," Vivian corrected, "which makes it stolen property. You can hand it over now quietly and walk out that door, or I can have these gentlemen detain you until the NYPD arrives to process you as an accessory to embezzlement. I believe the limit for grand larceny is quite low in New York. That piece is worth more than 10 years of your freedom." Sienna looked at the guards. They were impassive walls of muscle. She looked at the exit, so close, yet so far. Tears of frustration and humiliation welled in her eyes. She reached behind her neck, fumbling with the clasp. Her fingers shook so badly she couldn't undo it. "Allow me," Vivian said. She reached out. Her hands were cold. She undid the clasp with a deft, practiced click. She pulled the diamond choker from Sienna's neck. The weight of it vanishing made Sienna feel naked. Vivian held the diamonds up to the light, inspecting them. Beautiful. Van Cleef does excellent work. I'll have it auctioned for the charity. At least then it will do some good. She dropped the necklace into her clutch and snapped it shut. Now, Vivian said, her tone dismissing Sienna as if she were a waiter who had brought the wrong order. Go. The press is waiting at the front steps. I suggest the service exit in the back. It leads to the alley near the trash compactors. Appropriate, don't you think? Sienna opened her mouth to speak, to curse, to beg. She didn't know which. But there was nothing to say. She had played the game and lost everything. She turned and ran. She didn't walk. She ran, her heels clicking frantically on the marble, heading toward the back of the museum, away from the lights, away from the money, back into the dark. Vivian watched her go. Mrs. Vane. Arthur Penn approached from the ballroom. He looked weary. The police are here for Julian. They're asking for a statement. Vivian turned to Arthur. The mask of the grieving, betrayed wife slipped back into place, but her eyes remained steely. Excellent, she said. Let's go tell them how a trusting wife was duped by a criminal mastermind. I want to make sure the narrative is precise. And Julian, Arthur asked. He's asking to see you. He says he has leverage. Vivian smiled. Let him wait. I have a gala to finish. The transition from the velvet-draped warmth of the Metropolitan Museum to the fluorescent buzz of the 19th Precinct holding cell was a shock to the system that Julian Sterling couldn't process. He was still wearing his tuxedo, though the bow tie was gone, confiscated as a potential choking hazard. The patent leather shoes, once so shiny they reflected the paparazzi flashes, were now scuffed against the concrete floor. It had been 4 hours. 4 hours since the applause turned to jeers. 4 hours since the handcuffs clicked shut in front of the people he had spent a decade trying to impress. I get a phone call, Julian shouted at the bars for the 10th time. I know my rights. I need to call Preston. He's the best defense attorney in the city. The officer at the desk didn't even look up from his paperwork. Your lawyer has been contacted, Mr. Sterling. He said he'd be in touch. In touch? He works on retainer. He should be here. Julian paced the small cell. His mind was racing, trying to find the angle. There was always an angle. Vivian had humiliated him. Yes, she had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. But surely this was just a power play, a messy divorce negotiation tactic. She couldn't actually keep him in jail. He was Julian Sterling. He was the CEO. The company couldn't function without him. The Singapore deal, the one he had touted on stage, relied on his personal relationships with the Asian ministers. Finally, the heavy metal door buzzed open. A man walked in. It wasn't Preston, his shark of a lawyer who usually handled his messes. It was a junior associate, a kid barely out of law school named Davis, looking terrified. Davis! Julian gripped the bars. Where is Preston? Get me out of here. The bail hearing is in the morning, right? Davis didn't come close to the bars. He stood by the guard, clutching a briefcase. Mr. Sterling, Preston isn't coming. What do you mean he's not coming? I pay his firm $2 million a year. The firm has dropped you, sir. Davis said, his voice shaking. Conflict of interest. Conflict, I am the client. Actually, sir. Davis swallowed hard. The retainer for the firm is paid through Sterling Vane corporate accounts. Since the board voted to terminate you effective immediately at 8:45 p.m. tonight, the firm now represents the company. And the company, Is the plaintiff pressing charges against you?" Julian felt the blood leave his head. "So Preston is representing—" "Vivian. He's representing the board, sir, which is currently chaired by Mrs. Vane." Julian slumped against the cold cinder-block wall. They had cut off his defense. He was alone. "Fine," Julian spat. "I'll hire someone else. I have my own money, my personal accounts. Get me my phone. I need to access the Cayman holdings." Davis looked at the floor. "Sir, the asset freeze is comprehensive. The DOJ was served with the evidence of wire fraud an hour ago. They've frozen everything. Domestic offshore, even the crypto wallets you thought were anonymous." "How?" Julian whispered. "The crypto. No one knew about the crypto." "The audit was thorough, sir. Mrs. Vane's team. They had the private keys. They said they found them in a safe deposit box you opened in the company's name." Julian closed his eyes. He remembered that box. He had opened it 3 years ago to hide kickbacks from a construction deal. He had listed Vivian as the emergency beneficiary, thinking she was too clueless to ever check it. He had bet on her indifference. He had bet on her being the gardener wife. "She knew," Julian muttered. "She knew everything. For years." "There's one more thing," Davis said, pulling a document from his briefcase and sliding it through the slot in the bars. "Mrs. Vane wanted you to have this. She said it might help you sleep." Julian picked up the paper. It was a photocopy of a document titled Project Singapore Acquisition Structure. He scanned it. This was the deal he was so proud of. The acquisition of the Red Star Line. He had pushed it through the board, bypassing due diligence because he claimed he knew the guys running it. He had funneled $50 million of Sterling Vane money into Red Star Line to buy it. He read the fine print on the ownership of Red Star Line. Owner of Record VH Trust Holdings, Limited, beneficiary Vivian Vane. Julian dropped the paper. He hadn't expanded the company. He hadn't bought a competitor. He had stolen money from his wife's company to buy a shell company, owned by his wife. He had embezzled funds to pay her. She sold me her own empty shell company. Julian realized a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "I stole money to give it right back to her." He slid down the wall until he hit the floor. The genius of it was sickening. She hadn't just caught him, she had baited him. She knew he was desperate for a win to show the board. She created a fake opportunity, let him break the law to seize it, and then used that crime to destroy him. He was broke. He was in jail. And every dime he thought he had stolen was sitting safely in Vivian's trust. "Davis," Julian said, his voice hollow. "Go away." "Good luck, Mr. Sterling," the junior lawyer said, turning to leave. Julian sat in the silence of the cell. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a crushing, cold reality. He wasn't a titan. He was a bug, and Vivian Vane had just stepped on him. The fluorescent lights of the 19th Precinct, holding cell, buzzed with a sound that felt like a drill boring directly into Julian Sterling's skull. It was 8:00 a.m. He had been sitting on a steel bench for 11 hours, watching the erratic behavior of a man in the opposite cell, who was screaming about government drones. Julian looked down at himself. The tuxedo that had cost $6,000 was ruined, wrinkled, stained with sweat, and stripped of the dignity it was meant to convey. His cufflinks had been taken. His shoelaces were gone. He wasn't the CEO of Sterling Vane anymore. He was inmate number 4920. He had spent the night oscillating between rage and bargaining. He had mentally fired his entire legal team. He had drafted imaginary press releases explaining the misunderstanding. He had convinced himself that by morning the board would realize they needed him. The stock would tank without his face on the home page. They would come crawling back with a settlement offer. When the heavy steel door finally clanked open, Julian stood up, straightening his jacket, ready to negotiate his release. He expected Preston his shark of a lawyer. He would have settled for the terrified junior associate Davis. Instead, the guard stepped aside to reveal Vivian. She was a vision of unbothered elegance. She wore a cream-colored cashmere coat that looked soft enough to melt into a stark contrast to the grime of the precinct. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe chignon. She held a cup of coffee from a boutique cafe, the steam rising in lazy swirls. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. "You have 5 minutes," the guard grunted, closing the door behind her, but staying visible through the glass. Vivian walked to the plexiglass partition in the visitation booth. She didn't sit. She just stood there, sipping her coffee. Julian scrambled to the phone on the wall. He picked up the receiver, his hand shaking. "Vivian!" He breathed, his voice hoarse from shouting earlier. "Thank God, you have to get me out of here. This has gone too far. The point is made. I'm humiliated. Fine, but you can't leave me in here." Vivian picked up her receiver gracefully. "You look terrible, Julian. The lighting really doesn't do you any favors." "Stop it," Julian snapped, attempting to summon his old authority. "Listen to me. You need to drop the charges. If I go down for embezzlement, the company goes down. The SEC will freeze everything. You'll lose your inheritance, the trust, everything. You need me to spin this." Vivian tilted her head, a small, pitying smile playing on her lips. "You still don't get it, do you? You think you're the load-bearing wall of this house? But you were just the wallpaper, and I decided to redecorate. I built that company." Julian slammed his hand against the glass. "I secured the Singapore deal, the Red Star acquisition that was me. That was my relationship with the ministers." "Ah, yes, the Red Star line," Vivian said, her voice smooth and conversational. "Let's talk about that. That was your masterpiece, wasn't it? Funneling $50 million of company funds into a consulting shell corporation to buy the shipping rights." "It was necessary," Julian argued. "That's how business is done in Asia. I had to own the intermediary to control the deal." "I know," Vivian said. "And I know you thought that intermediary company Orion Holdings was anonymous. You thought you were stealing $50 million from the Vane Trust to pay yourself." "I was going to pay it back." "No, you weren't," she corrected him gently. "But here is the fascinating part, Julian. Did you ever check who actually owned the debt of Orion Holdings?" Julian paused. "It was a shell. It didn't have debt. It did after I bought it 6 months ago." Vivian revealed, her eyes sparkling with cold amusement. "I purchased the dormant entity of Orion Holdings through the trust in January. I sat on it. I let you discover it. I let you set up the illegal wire transfers to pump money into it." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt. "So," he whispered. "So," she finished, "you embezzled $50 million from my company to buy a company that I already owned. You stole money from my right pocket and put it into my left pocket, Julian. The capital never left the Vane estate. I haven't lost a dime. But you committed federal wire fraud to give your wife a bonus." Julian dropped the receiver. It swung by its metal cord, hitting the wall with a dull clatter. He fumbled to pick it up again. "You set me up," he gasped. That's entrapment. It's corporate governance, she countered. I just gave you enough rope. You tied the noose yourself. Julian slumped against the wall. The magnitude of her strategy was suffocating. She hadn't just reacted to his affair. She had orchestrated his professional suicide over the course of half a year. Why? He asked, his voice broken. Why wait? Why the gala? Why not just divorce me? Because of the vesting schedule, Julian. Vivian took a slow sip of her coffee, savoring the moment. Your contract states that your 10-year performance stock options worth roughly $200 million vest fully at midnight on November 14th. That was last night. Julian's eyes widened. He checked the clock on the wall. It was November 15th. I made it, he whispered, a flicker of hope igniting. I was still CEO at midnight. I was fired after the gala. The shares are mine. You can't touch them. Vivian shook her head, a look of mock disappointment on her face. Read the bylaws, Julian. If an executive is terminated for cause, specifically criminal misconduct involving moral turpitude, the clawback clause is retroactive to the start of the fiscal quarter, but only if the crimes are public knowledge before the vesting is ratified. She stepped closer to the glass. That's why I let you go on stage. That's why I let you speak. I needed you to be the CEO until 8:45 p.m. I needed the world to see the crime. I needed the embarrassment to be so public, so undeniable, that the board had no legal choice but to trigger the clawback immediately. She paused for effect. You didn't just lose your job, Julian. You lost the payout. You walked away with zero. The $200 million reverts to the company treasury. To me. Julian slid down the wall until he hit the floor. He was hyperventilating. He was broke. He was in jail. And he had funded his own destruction. And Sienna, he croaked, grasping for anything. She'll talk. She'll tell the press you planned this. Sienna is currently in a first-class seat on a flight to Ibiza, Vivian said dismissively. I bought her debt, Julian. The apartment lease you co-signed, the credit cards I paid them off this morning. In exchange, she signed an NDA and agreed to a very long vacation. She doesn't love you, Julian. She loved the lifestyle. And I'm the one who falls for the lifestyle. She turned to leave. No, Julian screamed, scrambling up and pounding on the glass. Vivian, don't leave me here. I'm your husband. Vivian stopped. She turned back one last time. The warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by the granite hardness of the vain legacy. You were never my husband, Julian, she said softly. You were an acquisition, and I just divested. She signaled the guard. The heavy door opened. Oh, she added, pausing in the doorway. We're removing the sterling from the building signage this afternoon. It's just vain logistics now. I always thought your name made the letterhead look cheap. The door clanged shut. Julian stood in the silence. He looked at the phone in his hand, hearing the dial tone buzzing like a flatline. He looked at the empty chair on the other side of the glass. He had walked into the Diamond Gala thinking he was the King of New York, holding a queen and a pawn. He realized too late that he was never the player. He was just a piece on the board, and he had been sacrificed to win the game. Julian hung up the phone. He sat down on the bench, put his head in his hands, and waited for the lawyers who would never come. And that is how Julian Sterling lost an empire of fortune and his freedom in a single night. He spent a decade thinking he was the smartest man in the room, never realizing that the quiet woman watering her orchids was pruning him back branch by branch until there was nothing left. It's a brutal reminder. True power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to show off at a gala. True power waits. It watches. And when the time is right, it strikes with absolute precision. Julian thought he was playing the game, but he was just holding the pieces for the woman who owned the board. What do you think? Was Vivian's revenge absolute justice, or was it too cruel to let him walk that red carpet knowing his life was over? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read all of them, and I'm dying to hear whose side you're on. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes betrayal and billion-dollar revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. We have a new story dropping next week about a Silicon Valley genius who stole the wrong code from the wrong intern. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. And remember, be careful who you step on to get to the top. They might just move the stairs.